Hey everybody, I'm here with Kate Holt. I'm just going to read you Kate's bio so you'll have a sense of where she's coming from. Kate Holt, RN, CCEP, is the Executive Director of the Institute of CoreEnergetics, a nonprofit training organization in New York, where she also teaches in the 4-year practitioner training and in the postgraduate mastery program. She graduated in 2003 and has been practicing since then. Kate teaches and supervises CoreEnergetics practitioners internationally. She owns Holt Mentoring and Education Services, which includes her private practice, working with individuals and groups. Kate has a deep love for the work of CoreEnergetics and its ripple effect in the world. Nice. So maybe let's just begin with you just giving people, many people may not have heard of CoreEnergetics, just some sense of what is it? What is that?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jeff. And I would say that hopefully a lot of your audience does know what CoreEnergetics is, because you have been someone who has endorsed our work to support a lot of what you talk about. So,
Yeah.
but I'm certainly happy to talk about it. So CoreEnergetics, I mean, we call it an evolutionary process, so I know my clients, even though I am a CoreEnergetics practitioner, they say I'm going to therapy. But it really is a personal development process that supports people in emotional and spiritual maturity, which is something you write about a lot. And I think that's the goal of our work, is that emotional and spiritual maturity. And we do it through a somatic approach. So CoreEnergetics comes from a history of a blend of bioenergetics and some spiritual work called the Pathwork. And of course, that's Alexander Lowen and John Pierrakos. And then before them, they were both students of Wilhelm Reich,
Right.
Who was originally a student of Sigmund Freud. So, the underpinnings are there that have a psychoanalytic kind of foundation, but very much involved in looking at what we call character structure, where you're looking at a human being that you're working with through the lens of these 5 main types that have to do with when you got wounded in your development,
Yeah.
and then a pattern of protection or defensiveness that was created. And that pattern lives in your psyche, it lives in your body, it affects your spirituality, it affects you on the mental level. And so, John talked about a pyramid where the base was the body, and then the emotions, and then the mental, and then the will, which is, about your intentionality, conscious or unconscious, and then also the spirit. So when I'm working with people and when I'm teaching, that's what I'm working through. And so it's not like, okay, we start at the body and then next week we go, it's all one unitive entity, and it's all being affected, each layer affected by the other. So how's that for a starter?
Oh, that's great. And so,
Yeah.
just to jump in, so it's important to explain that, whereas Freud might have focused on personality defenses, against feeling or presence or something, what Reich began to do and what John and Alexander took, I believe, to the next level was understanding how those defenses live themselves out somatically within the body itself. So, for example, how in response to various experiences, discomforts, unmet needs, traumas in early life, we didn't just defend on a personality level, we defended within the body. We shallowed our breath, for example. We pulled our head up and away from our body in a kind of a schizoid way so that we're sort of experiencing reality through 2 different systems rather than one integrated systems. We tightened our hips or rigidified our bodies so as to armor ourselves against feeling. We became very loose and open and completely non-rigidified in a way as another form of response to various experiences. So
Yes.
So when you work in CoreEnergetics, just like within bioenergetics, I know they're not aligned in every regard, but there is a fundamental agreement, I think, that working within the body itself to enliven those frozen places, to put it simply, and to encourage the release of feeling that was held there, memory, to connect to all of that material, to express and to come into wholeness again through the body, is one of the primary ways to break through those defenses against feeling that we often carry throughout life unconsciously. Does that sound
That
about?
sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think of, when we talk about what's happening in the body, the rigidification, right? It might be in one person loosey goosey and another person rigid, but it lives in the body. And when we work to open up the blocks, to loosen the armor, so if you're loosey goosey, it's because you've got tightness in certain places, So when you loosen the armor, it loosens the defensive stance, it loosens how you see the world. It literally changes your lens. So, I think you've explained that really well. And, we talk about those 5 main structures. Lowen and Pierrakos, and probably right before them, gave some pretty scary names to them. And so we're leaning more towards naming them based on the energetics of it.
And what were the 5 originally, Kate? Just so
they were schizoid, which you mentioned,
like
oral,
a splitting offness.
Yeah, which has to do with really early wounding, where you didn't feel welcomed in the world.
Yeah, so it's just too uncomfortable to be here, so you sort of dissociate or disconnect, right?
Right. So the energetics of that are fragmenting of the energetics. So you might see that person tilts their head a lot, or maybe they have a really hard time with eye contact, or even having symmetry in their eyes. Their joints, I call them leaky, but you can see the difference in the joints of someone who has that defense, doesn't look as integrated, right? Oral has to do with a little bit after birth, and has to do with it's the wound of nurturance, or interruption of nurturance. So the bonding, the attachment somehow gets interrupted, and the child, the defensive stance that the child gets is that they actually don't have enough energy. They're deprived, and so they kind of leak energy. They almost like can't tolerate a big energetic system. So we call that undercharge defense.
And it's like a perpetual spilling out or spilling over or something. That's one of the symptoms of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the crisis around that this is built around is the issue of need, right? So someone who has that oral wound and oral defense is either going to be very needy, or they're going to be very compensated, and they don't need anybody or anything. And so they just totally disconnect from their need. Yeah. And then the third one, which is the scary term, masochism, masochist, we call this the overcharge defense. So this comes from, and again, a little further in the development, where the child is trying to assert their independence and their free expression, and they're loved, but they're also controlled. So there's like a hovering parent, and what happens in that child is they might have 2 impulses, or they might have an impulse to lash out at this control that they're meeting, and at the same time that lashing out could mean the death of them, right, in their mind, because I can't lash out against my caregivers. And the people
so they internalize it, and they lash out within.
And then they internalize it, and they internalize it, as you're saying, lash out within. They do that, but also on a physical level, they have tremendous tension in their bodies. All over.
Got it. And the fourth?
The fourth depends on which way you talk about it, but I'll say psychopathic, which is, again, sounds like a horrible thing to be.
It doesn't sound like a compliment.
Right. We call it the displaced defense. It's where the energy is displaced, often upwardly displaced. So might be somebody that is living in their head a lot and has a lot of charge in their upper body, but not so much getting down into the lower body where their sexuality lives. And so it has to do with a wounding of being made special by the parents, like maybe even used by the parent, like, you're such a good boy, it's all about you, how you reflect on me.
Mhm.
And then the rug gets pulled out from underneath, and so it's like a seduction and a betrayal. And so that person with that upper displacement, or it can be a lower displacement where the energy gets displaced. So you might see a woman with very seductive looking hips, but she's tiny up top. That can be that downward displacement.
Got it.
And she's probably more likely to use seduction as a way of getting her way. And getting her way is all about trying to feel safe in the world. And the
Gotcha.
same with the upward displacement. The upward displacement is about intimidation and aggression. And again, this person is just trying to feel safe in the world to defend against that betrayal from happening again.
Right.
And that's around 3 to 5, and then the final one is the rigid, which we don't rename because it really does describe the energy. So we just call it the rigid defense. And that has really a wounding around the child's sexuality being rejected by the parent. So, maybe when you're a little child, 3, 4, 5, 6, you love your parents, you love life with your whole self, your whole being. And because the child is developing, when the child brings all of that energy, one of the parents might really experience that as threatening. Like this is sexual energy. And so there's a rejection. And what happens in the child is there's a split between the heart and the pelvis, the heart and the sexuality, and everything gets rigid. And literally their spine is very rigid. They often have really beautiful, harmonious bodies, and they get very focused on accomplishment and showing how good they are, because somehow
Right.
they feel like their goodness has been rejected.
Right.
Yeah. So.
And isn't there a sixth one, which is something that's related to healthy functioning? I thought there was another term that sort of described, that thing we seldom encounter or something, where we're actually aligned and integrated and vibrating and flowing and fluid, and everything's kind of happening the way the good Lord intended or something? Or have we not even figured out how to define healthy functioning yet?
I think we're not able to define it yet. I mean, I think we're able to define moving toward it, right?
Yeah, I think so.
But I think in reality, there are no perfect parents. So even the best of families, right? Crisis happens, or, anything can happen in a family.
Yeah.
There's dynamics between siblings that maybe the best mom for the oldest child doesn't know what to do when the second one comes along. And so there's no perfection in even the best of families. So that wounding can happen to everyone.
Yes. So there's no enlightened consciousness. There's just maybe a more enlightening one.
Yeah.
Or something. It's interesting, when I was in the bioenergetic training program, and Al Lowen was my therapist for a while, and we've talked about that before. And I did something in Boulder, Colorado. I think it was the first or second meeting of the United States Association of Body-Centered Psychotherapists, and John was there doing like a day workshop or something like that. And I had this we'll get into it in a minute, but I had a very interesting experience with both of them about talking about each other. But the thing I wanted to say is, when I was first exposed to all of this, I didn't like all the labels, the old psychoanalytic categories, and it really helped me very much. I mean, what helped me to understand as a way of making sense of myself was how, and this resonated so much more than any talk-based model ever did for me, to really understand how I lived inside of my bones, and how shallowing my breath, as one example, was a defense against breathing in too much pain and discomfort, and how that shallowing of the breath affected the way I moved through the world on all kinds of levels. It was such a poignant understanding on many levels. And then I went into the bioenergetic training program, and they described me. They had to categorize me. So they categorized me as an oral with a rigid overlay. That was the saying. And at first I was like, oh God, who the fuck are you people to tell me what And then after I thought about it and spent more time inside of it, it kind of felt kind of true that I was an oral with a rigid overlay. I almost bought a T-shirt that just described me as an oral. So, there's been a lot of criticism of the labels, and I think we have to be careful how we use them. And at the same time, if they're used in the right way, they can provide a lot of insight for people who are in
Yeah.
the process, so long as they can relate to them on a somatic level and not just on a conceptual level, because that's when it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and ultimately, we teach our students all of these so that they understand what they look like in the body, so they can see what they need to see when they're working with someone. But ultimately, it's all foundational information. And when you're really working with somebody, you're working with the body and the defense that's presenting right in front of you in the moment,
Yeah.
and going from there. So if you're seeing shallow breath, you're gonna create an exercise that supports spontaneous depth of breath.
Yeah, and then
Or,
see what comes up in that process.
exactly.
As an inquiry, without an assumption of the label that's going to affect my experience of coming back into my body,
Right.
for example.
Yeah, and often what happens is um, students or even clients will say, "Well, what do you think I am?
Mm.
Which one of those things do you think I am?" And I always put it back to them. Which one are you relating to? Because
Right.
you know
Yeah.
that's where the information is most important. And of course, I know what I see, and we'll get to it.
Yeah. So let me, you read my book, Grounded Spirituality, and wrote a
Yes,
beautiful
I did.
endorsement. Yes, thank
Yes,
you.
I
Yeah, well,
did.
there you go.
Yeah.
We'll just try to sell some books.
Here in Marlton, New Jersey, where I am right now, that's where this book is.
Nice. The book is in New Jersey. I
Uh,
feel very comfortable with that. So, so much of my process happened with Lowen and happened in my body. And, my whole experience, I didn't start with spirituality. I started with really psychotherapy. I didn't really think about spirituality very much. And I remember, but I would have this incredible experience of going deeply into the emotional material in my body, releasing material that was obstructing me, whether it was in bioenergetics or holotropic breath work or any of these modalities.
mhm.
And at the end of these experiences, if I could see them all the way through in that moment, I would have an experience of being in a unified field, what somebody might call unity consciousness.
Yes.
And it never happened for me independent of or in a meditative state or such. I mean, I arrived in a meditative state, but I always arrived there through the energizing and movement in my body itself. And then I began to hear this word spirituality. So I asked Lowen about the word spirituality. And I said, Al, what are they talking about spirituality? And because for me, emotional maturation and spiritual maturation were synonymous. The more I developed emotionally, the more my capacity to be present in a more expansive sense developed as well. They seem to be the exact same experience. So I never understood this bifurcation in the patriarchal spiritual model between the selfhood and the spiritual field. To me, it was the same thing. And what they were talking about primarily, and what I've written about in the book, was dissociative. So I asked Lowen, and I said, what are they talking about spirituality? What does it mean? And he, in that Lowenian style, he said, oh, like the way he did. And he said, what spirituality is to ground and energize and open the body, to become alive in your body. He goes, that's spirituality. That's what it means to be spirited,
Mm.
And I felt like that was exactly what my experience is. And I feel like I've been writing and developing those ideas ever since. But interestingly, because I know John Pierrakos and Lowen formed and developed bioenergetics together, and then John went in another direction. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I had said to Lowen, so what is this Pierrakos? What is Pierrakos? What is Pierrakos? How do you feel about, his perspective on this question? And he said, John knows nothing about the body. And then I asked Pierrakos in Boulder, I said, what do you think of Lowen? And he said, Lowen knows nothing about spirituality. And so they were these two old cuckers that just had very clear, like their opinion came out instantly, like this is something they're very clear about. And my experience with Lowen was that he knew a lot about spirituality. He just didn't call it spirituality. So what is it that Pierrakos brought to us through CoreEnergetics that integrated bioenergetics, of course, but that also built upon it in a way that feels solid and sustainable from your perspective?
Yeah. So, he met this woman, Eva Brock, her name was, and she she was involved with the Pathwork. She was channeling, and I know you have a little thing with channels, but she was channeling material from something called the Guide. And coming through the filter of Eva, it had a very psychoanalytic way of of describing psychospiritual issues.
Okay.
And the guide talked about, well, many things. So there's a body of 258 lectures, and they're amazing. And sometimes they drive me crazy, but they're profound. And so anyway, the part that comes from the Pathwork that probably differentiates us the most from bioenergetics and probably any other field is that we look at the personality from the perspective of higher self, lower self, and mask, right? So you've heard people talk about shadow, and shadow, I would say, is part of the lower self, but it's not all of the lower self.
Okay.
So I'm just going to talk about this the way I talk about it to new students. And the way I talk about the higher self is, it's the energy that you came in with.
Mm-hmm.
So you come into this life and you have all this unintegrated but lovely, vibrant energy. You're vibrating at a very high frequency. Newborns laugh with their whole body. They cry with their whole body. Well, newborns don't laugh, but after a few weeks they laugh. And then when they laugh with their whole body. They do everything with this full-bodied experience. And then life happens, and a need gets thwarted, or a cruelty comes toward them, or a rejection, and they start to have what we call an organismic reaction. There's a reaction. So this goes along with what I'm just saying, goes along with the way bioenergetics discusses character structure development, but it also fits in with this spiritual aspect.
Okay.
So this organismic reaction, right? I have this reaction with my whole body. And that reaction is what we would call in the lower self, my no to life.
So we'll call it a defense against feeling as well.
It is a defense against feeling, for sure. That's where it originates. It's about survival. It's like this thing that I have to feel is I can't do it by myself. I'm too young, or I'm too unintegrated. I can't do it. And so it develops this reaction. And in order to defend against feeling, it might be that there's a rage. Think about a baby who has been crying for mommy to come, and mommy doesn't come, and so then it starts to have a tantrum, right? And it's trying to use all of its will to force her to come, and then she still doesn't come. Well, then what? It's like, okay, my need was intolerable. Now my reaction is intolerable. So what do I do with that? And that sort of goes underground. That's that lower nature goes underground. And then the child, on some level, figures out a way to be in the world to get their needs met that isn't exactly the truth of who they are. So maybe they'll be a really good little girl or boy and go to sleep, especially, or as soon as they're supposed to, so that they don't have to feel that need. So it's like they shut down the need, they shut down the reaction to the need, and then the layer that's on top is this, what we call the mask. And I'm saying on top, but it's in and through, it's everywhere.
Throughout the whole system, right?
Yeah. So the mask is sort of this layer of pretend. This is who I think I have to be in order to get my needs met. So a really simple example is a friendly mask. If I'm friendly to you, you'll be friendly to me. My friendliness isn't really coming from necessarily a genuine place. It's about trying to get a need met.
Right.
Now, underneath that person might have, a generous heart, lots of love, but it's being distorted because of this negative place inside,
Right.
So that initially, while it starts out as protection against feeling, there's also something, and this is another area that I think Core differentiates itself, is that there's something called negative pleasure. And so in the place where I initially defend against feeling, I actually feel really powerful in that place. I'm actually creating something from that place. And even though that creation is negative, there's pleasure in the process of creating, just in and of itself. So it's like, not only is it about not wanting to feel, I actually start to really like it. I start to like the way I am in this negative place. Now, eventually it costs, right? eventually it becomes unbearable. And that's often what makes people walk into a session with me or with you or with any of us, you know, is that what this protection that I've built for myself is now my cage. It's now my
Yeah.
prison.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I mean, so much of the culture is living, you know, in the heart of their adaptations and disguises, and often not even knowing that there's something, some other way of being that they can access and where they can move from. Um, when they talk about higher self, so if I was a being that was functioning from deeply within my higher self, what would that look like? How would I be moving through the world?
yeah. So I'm all of a sudden getting an echo. The goal of the work, I mean, if there's a goal, I mean, there sort of is. So initially we're looking to penetrate that mask so that we can expose what's under the mask.
Yeah.
Lower self has a ton of energy in it, right? If I've been holding back from you for 25 years and now we access my holdback, I'm going to unleash a lot of energy. And when that energy and that the truth of it comes out, it is transformed into something that's light. Now, I know that's another weird word, but if you're thinking of lower self as dark or shadow as dark, then light is my expansion, my openness, my connection to my heart. So to me, higher self is something that's always operating, but I'm not always conscious of it, and I'm not always connected to it. And so if I can penetrate this mask, if I can release some of that energy of that lower self, then I do go into a unitive state. I go into a state where I can feel my aliveness, I can feel my connection to my deepest self. But that's also where my connection to you is without protection. That's where my connection to God, or however you want to name a higher power, that's where that connection lives. I can't access that from defense. I
So,
can pretend I am,
yeah, no,
right?
absolutely. So I feel, so much in my writing, I have problems with what I would call patriarchal spirituality and its emphasis on higher than or rising above or transcending, because I believe much of that is dissociative and unintegrated. I don't think that's what you're talking about. I feel like when you talk about higher self, you're almost talking about the healthier experience of self.
Yeah, and I guess another way that I would put it is core essence. You know,
Got it.
so
So
it's
the
not
soul self or
the
something.
soul self. Yes.
Yeah, got
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, not
Um,
above. Not definitely not above.
No, yeah, John just characterizing it in a different way.
Hmm.
But it is interesting. The feeling I got from Lowen when discussing Pierrakos was that he saw him as sort of more floaty or something, and as though John saw Alexander as kind of too grounded in the earth realms or something. And I'd have to go farther into studying core to really try to make sense of that, and understand it. But I want to read a quote from Grounded and see if we can just talk a bit about it and see if where this aligns or doesn't align with core perspective.
Sure.
Yeah. Because I'm particularly interested in this question of, bioenergetics was defined as an analytic framework. So it wasn't just about like primal therapy, getting lost in the primal feeling. It was also very grounding and was about making sense of our experience as well as feeling into our experience. So this relationship between mind and feeling, and when kind of knowing our stuff actually helps us, and when being lost in the knowing actually prevents us from doing the deeper transformative work, is interesting to me. So I'll just read this quote. Bottom line is that you cannot heal and resolve your emotional material with your mind. Knowing our issues is not the same as healing our issues. Your emotional material does not evaporate because you watch it. I have known many who could watch and name their patterns and issues as if they were scientists researching their own consciousness, but nothing fundamentally changed because they refused to come back down into their bodies and move their feelings through to transformation. It's safe up there, above the fray, witnessing the heartache without actually engaging it. Yes, you may be able to get so skilled at a witnessing consciousness that you can overpower your triggers, but that's not presence. Real presence comes through the open heart. The key to the transformation of challenging patterns and wounds is to heal them from the inside out, not to analyze them, not to watch them like an astronomer staring at a faraway planet through a telescope, but to jump right into the heart of them, encouraging their expression and release, stitching them into new possibilities with the thread of love. You want to live a holy life, heal your heart. That's the best meditation of all. Close quote. So I guess, I mean, I wonder, first of all, if that resonates. I feel like it probably resonates with core perspective, but I also want to sort of make sense of where the mind and understanding one's experience and making sense of, even analytically, is a helpful thing when you're working with somebody in the core energetics model.
Yeah, so absolutely makes sense to me. It resonates. And I want to say one of the things that John talked about a lot, and we actually have a whole course called Energy and Consciousness. So um, when I hear you saying, you know, watching it from above and all of that, that to me does feel like a spiritual bypass. It does not allow a person to really heal something. As you said, they're rising above it. They're trying to transcend something that they've never actually embodied.
Mm-hmm.
So it with this work, you know, you tap into an energy supply that's been held down because of how you've protected yourself.
Right.
And when that energy supply comes, it informs your consciousness, and consciousness affects your energy. So it becomes this kind of benevolent cycle, if you could call it that, to work with. But one of the things I think that is a useful, it's useful, the idea of an observer self,
Mm-hmm.
right? So not to observe yourself and be disconnected and dissociative.
Yeah, not with the intention of dissociating, right?
But with an intention to be in it and to not be engulfed by it. So for
And
an
to see
example,
it, and maybe to see where you need to work or something.
right. Because if you, but here's one of the reasons it's so important, because if you're going to work with what we're calling lower self, right? So you might become in touch with your own cruelty. You might become in touch with your desire for vengeance.
Mm.
Well, that's really hard to admit if you don't have a healthy, strong observer self that can say, that's only part of me, you know, because if you don't have that, you'll just think that's all of who you are, and then you'll give up, which is what I would call a trick of the lower self. You know, it wants you to give up. It's almost like the ego that doesn't want you to expand, because then that's the death of the ego at this level, right?
Well, so that I feel like just to differentiate, you're describing the unhealthy parts of the ego, but I feel like you're
Correct.
also saying you need a healthy ego in order to be able to hold the space for the fragmentation and
Yes,
dissolution of the armored self as part of this process, right?
that's right. So that healthy ego would be the part of you that could have an observer self that could say, look at this way I'm reacting.
And I can
This isn't,
tolerate it, and I can tolerate it.
yeah.
Right.
And then I can change it because I can tolerate it. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing people really don't understand so much. They have various painful experiences with people, and they want people to make various admissions. I knew I wanted my mother to make all these admissions, you know, and she did her best, and she made some admissions. But the one thing I know now, and I think I knew to some extent then, is my mother's sense of self was so fractured, and her healthy ego was so poorly developed that she didn't have a strong enough sense of self to acknowledge her imperfections. It was just too much, because on so many levels she was feeling so much disdain, I think, towards herself, that she couldn't tolerate any reflection that indicated that she'd done something wrong. And we go through our lives in many relationships seeking accountability, and particularly children with parents, but in many relationships feeling terribly about ourselves if we can't get them to reflect back and acknowledge their wrongdoing. And I think what we fail to realize is quite often it's not personal. It's not because they on some level don't know they did something wrong. It's because they're not intact enough to acknowledge the meaning.
I think of that with people who lie. You know, like they'll lie because they can't tolerate the truth.
And what
They
comes
don't
up
have
when
that.
they're in the truth.
Yeah,
I've known
yeah,
some pathological liars that
yeah.
their egos were not developed enough. There wasn't enough integration to look at a piece and acknowledge that that piece was shadowy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So in your work with people, you've been working with people since early 2000s.
Mhm.
how have you changed as a result of this process? How has working with other people forced you to like raise your game to the next vibratory level or something? How are you different as a practitioner now
Oh,
from
God.
or in the very beginning?
Well, I mean, so much of the practitioner training is personal work, right? So in my 4 years, I did so much work on myself. And when I say work on myself, I'm talking about having the courage to own the parts of myself that I never wanted to see. But there's something so powerful when you own it, that you get so free inside yourself, you know. So I think over the years, probably, you know, it takes a lot of courage, and you have to take a lot of risks to do this work well
Mhm.
for your personal self. And then when you're working with other people, you take a lot of risks to confront them. And, you know, finding finding ways to confront people that they can hear it and not be demolished by it or devastated by it. And I'm not saying I do it perfectly, but I've gotten really good at being able to confront somebody from a place of love,
Mhm.
so that they can see that the reason I'm confronting you like this is because I can see how much more you can have in life, how much more you can be
Mhm.
if this defense is taken away. Or taken away is not the right word, but challenged, you know, because we need our defenses. It's a
Yeah,
scary world, you know.
or just transformed and become more
Yeah,
conscious or something.
exactly.
So you would say you're interfacing more from your higher self than your lower self now, essentially.
Yeah, and look, you know, I mean, another thing with the work is that the lower self doesn't ever go away. You can transform it, but it doesn't ever go away. So the more work you do, it's almost like the more you've got to be on the lookout for your lower self, because it gets trickier and sneakier because you're just smarter and you figured more things out. And so, you know, that's another piece for me, is I'm always in this work myself. I'm always working with someone else, whether it's supervision or a practitioner. But, you know, I'm always looking at what am I doing here
Mhm.
that's getting in the way of me bringing all of myself, you know.
Mhm.
I think another thing in terms of like what 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 has continued to transform in me as I've worked with other people, and probably because I teach, so I'm working with groups a lot, classes, is really stepping into my own authority, right? So right now I'm the executive director of the Institute. You know, I'm in a leadership position. But long before that, it was about finding my authority in myself,
Right.
to be willing to stand alone when something wasn't right. You know, when something didn't match up with my soul's alignment, and say, as much as I love all these people, I'll stand alone for the truth.
Mhm.
That's a really scary place to go, but it's, again, so freeing, so empowering. And the imaginary I have to be alone is not necessarily going to happen, but you
Right.
have to be willing to go there. You know, I mean, I
Yeah.
see it in what you write. You know, you are willing to say, everybody in the world could disagree with me, but I know this is true. I'm going to say it. That's being in your own authority, you know.
You know, I think it's about we're all on a journey towards what I would call the truer self, you know, where
Hmm.
we're really speaking what we believe to be truth. And of course, our understanding of truth can unfold. And in bringing my work to the world and it growing and expanding in various directions, I've had to interface with all kinds of parts of me who are afraid to stand fully in that truth and are afraid of suffering, afraid of violence, afraid of, you know, I've had all kinds of paranoid parts of me emerge from early life when I was speaking truth in an untruthful environment and suffered endlessly as a child. This is so much of the process of becoming more the leader that lives within you, is being able to stand in the fire of what you perceive to be as true and to speak it and to hold it and to live with the fact that you're going to get all kinds of pushback. And when I first started, it was very, very difficult to handle all the pushback. And now I kind of enjoy it now. I don't really seem to make much of a difference because I've kind of gone through all those stages. But like you're describing, now you're able to sit in the one seat as executive director. 12, 15 years ago, probably wouldn't have been able to do that, right? I mean,
No.
yeah.
And I'll say the other thing that I think is a benefit of the work that I still continue to manifest is that it's not just about authority and power. It's also about being able to really love and be loved. Like, I get so much love.
Mm,
I get so much love,
yeah.
from my colleagues, from students, from family. Like, I can take love in a way that I couldn't when I was so protective.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah.
So
Did you ever meet John?
I did. He was my teacher for about a year and a half before he died. Yeah.
Yeah. Got it. Cool.
So.
Yeah, I loved his energy. I remember Lowen was sort of like a serious, kind of like earthbound kind of a character, Jewish character. And I love that. I had great transference to him because of my Jewish grandfather, who I love so much.
My cat.
Even when Lowen would answer the phone during a session, I just thought it was the cutest thing in the world. Any other therapist, he'd say, keep kicking, keep kicking. He'd answer the phone. Moishi, I gotta go. I got a boy kicking in the other room. Any other therapist did that, I would leave instantly and ask for my money back. With Lowen, he's so cute. He's such a cute grandpa. I love it.
Yeah.
And Pierrakos had brightly lit eyes in a different way. So did Lowen, but in a different way. He had like a yellow, I think it was like a yellow shirt and a polka dot tie, and he did have apparently more positive energy, lighter energy coming off of him. And I didn't really take that lightness very seriously because of my own biases, probably. And because he wasn't a Jewish grandfather, I didn't have good transference with him. I had good transference with him.
Yeah. Well, John was very smart, very, very smart. And, when I read, English was not his first language. He was Greek. And when I read his book, CoreEnergetics, I remember thinking the words weren't so easy. It wasn't, you could tell it wasn't,
Right.
it was all English. It was fine. But there was something so powerful in what he wrote. Like, I could feel his heart in his writing so much.
Yeah.
And, I'll just tell you I don't have that many John stories, but I have a couple little ones. This one is, we would have what we call a sanctuary service during the training. And it's this idea of nurturing your spirit. We've worked in our bodies and our psyches the whole weekend. And on Sunday morning, we would have a sanctuary service. And so basically it was students produced it and said, here's the theme, and let's talk about this and decorate the altar and make some beautiful scenery. But anyway, this one, and John was probably 79 at the time of this one. And the people were standing up and claiming something that they felt great about, And John stood up and he said, "I'm an excellent lover." And, everybody fell out. It was just so cute,
If he does say so himself.
If he does say so himself, yeah. But anyway, something very sweet about him. And John could also be very intimidating because he was confrontational,
Right.
both with the body and with the psyche. So
yeah. A couple of powerful guys. I mean, these are real heart-centered pioneers. No bullshit. And I remember I'd go see Lowen in Connecticut, and then he'd send me upstairs. I'd do like a Friday, and I'd leave and integrate and come back on Saturday and do another session. And then he'd say, go upstairs and work with Leslie. His wife, Leslie, was upstairs doing a bioenergy. He would time it so I'd be able to do this bioenergetic exercise class with, 6 or 8 people in the living room. And I think most of them, as I recall, were challenged individuals. We used to call mentally challenged. And I have never, ever been in an environment with people who work deeper, harder. I mean, it was the gnarliest, edgiest. I couldn't keep up with the whole process. It was
wow.
It was no bullshit. There was no softy toffee psychotherapeutic approach with these people. It was let's get to it or get out. It was really that simple. And
wow.
Yeah, powerful.
Mm.
Where can people find CoreEnergetics online and find a list of practitioners? That's my first question.
So it's our website is CoreEnergetics.org,
Yeah,
and on the top right corner is find a practitioner. We have a directory there.
great. And how
Um,
can they find Kate if they want to possibly work with Kate?
um, so my website is Kate. I'm sorry, what's my website? KateHolt.global, GLOBAL,
Okay,
KateHolt.global.
great.
And yeah, I mean, I'm we've got practitioners in many parts of the country, not everywhere, but so if people want to reach out to me through the institute, I'm happy to refer somebody where they live.
And it's not just in America. I mean, the website has practitioners worldwide, doesn't it?
We do have, we're in the process of building an international directory.
Oh,
Right now, the website that I'm giving is pretty much the US. There are a few people that have joined our practitioner directory who've graduated from programs in other countries, but there are programs all over the world
yeah.
in CoreEnergetics. And yeah, so that's pretty much how you get to us. But I wanted to say, I want to thank you, Jeff, for writing this book and the other things that you've written. I first found you on Facebook, and was like, here, who is this guy that is saying things that I wish I had said, and saying it so well and reaching so many people with your your persistence of truth, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
but 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 this work, and I know you feel this, that this embodied approach that doesn't bypass the you know it's like it's so needed. I
Well,
really
I don't think what we've been calling spirituality for centuries is. I think almost all of it is a bypass, actually, and because if you're pitting the spiritual self against your humanness, that's the first indication that you're dealing with a bypass model. Where the self isn't real, the body's not real, the feelings aren't real, your identifications aren't real, your pain body isn't real, it's not really you. There's some absolute self out there in the equanimous emptiness field or some nonsense. We're not birds, and we do have a self. We have this beautiful, magnificent self with beautiful stories coursing through it. We have to work through the stories to get them to the place where we're perceiving them and growing from them in the right way. I get that, but we don't want to throw the whole human out with the holy bathwater. And so for me, embodiment is really the path. And in the forwards of the book, Andrew Harvey wrote the forward, and when he wrote it in that way, I was like, oh, that's what I've been doing. I'm just writing about re-embodiment. And I think that, for me, the real spiritual teachers, the real spiritual practitioners are the somatic and body-centered psychotherapists, and not people who call themselves spiritual teachers. You can develop a thread of consciousness, be a good meditation teacher, be a master witnesser, all those things. But for me, the real spiritual field is the one that encompasses the broadest range of reality. And if you're not in your body, and you're not in the selfhood, and you're not in the story, and you're not in your identifications, well, you're not really here. You call that non-duality, but they're not really here. It's a trick. And so if we don't start right here with this magnificent and complicated container and temple, then I don't think we can consider ourselves to be on a spiritual path. Because we are the spiritual path. We are the Course in Miracles, and it begins and ends within the body itself. So I love what CoreEnergetics is about. I love what Bio's about. I love what Peter Levine's doing, somatic experiencing. I saw great value in Ron Kurtz's work, in Hakomi, which approached it in a very different and in a more subtle way. I hear good things about David Berceli's TRE method, and there's a scan therapy person, Lydia Becker, who I've heard great things about, who's working out of San Francisco, Germany. And in Canada, I know Christine Potney, haveallyourfeelings.com. I've heard very good things about her. And, I think we've really
She's one
got
of
to.
our graduates. Yep.
Yeah, I've heard good. I've sent people to her, and I've only ever heard good things. That's all I know. But I think it's happening in Toronto. They're developing it in Toronto, which is a beautiful thing for it, beautiful place for it. So I think we really need to celebrate somatic and body-centered psychotherapies and begin to understand that this is a spiritual path. It's a healing path. It's a transformative path, and it's a path that's intended. And you said it earlier. It's not just a therapy. You described it in a different way. It really is a way of being that's inviting you in the direction of being here in an inclusive consciousness, what I call the holy, right? So I celebrate your work and the work of all of you. And let's keep bringing it to the world, because if we don't get into our bodies, we're not going to be able to do anything to help our species or our planet.
It's true.
Yeah. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Jeff. And how do people get your book, Jeff?
Well, Amazon's easy. It's there in audio. I recorded the audio in a cold week in Toronto this winter. Ebooks are all around, and it's on Amazon. And if bookstores don't have it, they can ask them, and they can order them in. And libraries will order them in too through Baker.
Right.
And so yeah, and in abroad, Book Depository has it, and they deliver worldwide. And Amazon in the UK, for some reason, won't have it to the end of June, maybe because the first group sold out of books. But apparently it'll be there soon, shortly. So it's around. It's everywhere.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. See you again.
It's been a pleasure.
You too. Bye.